I feel like I'm drowning in slow motion while everyone around me just watches. 80 hours a week at work. A mountain of debt that grows taller by the day. A home that was never my dream but now consumes my every waking moment. And a marriage where I've become nothing more than a resource to be depleted, a vessel emptied of time, energy, and spirit, until there's nothing left. Yesterday, I finally said no for the first time in years. Now I'm sitting here wondering if that single word just ended my marriage. Before my wife entered my life, I lived simply. My modest 3-bedroom ranch wasn't going to win any architectural awards, but it was paid for, comfortable, and most importantly, mine. I had reasonable work hours that left me time to actually live. I had savings. I had hobbies. I had peace. I remember the last weekend before we got serious. I spent it rebuilding the carburetor on my project car, then grilling with a couple of friends while we watched the sunset from my backyard deck. Nothing special, but the kind of simple contentment that I now look back on with an ache in my chest that feels physical. My wife and I met through mutual friends. She was vibrant, full of energy and dreams that seemed to spill out of her whenever she spoke. I was drawn to that energy. It felt like standing next to a live wire. What I didn't understand then was that such intensity requires fuel, and I would become that fuel. The transition was gradual. First, it was just spending more time together, normal relationship stuff. Then came talks about how my house wasn't really suitable for our future. My perfectly good home suddenly had 1,000 flaws I'd never noticed before. The neighborhood wasn't right. The schools weren't good enough for her daughter. The layout wouldn't work for when we have more kids. I should have seen it then. The subtle way she positioned her desires as inevitable futures, as though the decision had already been made. But I was in love, or at least what I thought was love. Maybe it was just the intoxication of being needed, being central to someone else's happiness. I remember the first time she brought her daughter over to my house. The little girl looked around with uncertain eyes, clutching her mother's hand. My wife pointed out everything that was wrong with the place: the outdated kitchen, the small bedrooms, the lack of a playroom. I found myself apologizing, as if my perfectly functional home was somehow a failure. That night, after they left, I sat alone on my back porch looking at the stars. I had cold beer in my hand and a strange hollowness in my chest. It was the first time I felt that peculiar emptiness, the sensation of being found wanting despite having been perfectly content moments before. I didn't recognize it then as a warning sign. I mistook it for love, for the noble desire to provide more for this woman and her child. I thought the emptiness was just the natural ache of wanting to give someone everything. How could I have known that emptiness would become my constant companion? The custom house was her dream, not mine. I can still remember standing in the empty lot as she described the grand entryway, the gourmet kitchen with double islands, the owner's suite with its own sitting area. I nodded along, watching the price tag in my head climb with each feature she described. "We deserve this," she kept saying. "After everything you've worked for, don't you want something that reflects your success?" The truth was, my modest house had reflected my success perfectly. But somehow I found myself nodding, signing papers, watching my financial security transform into architectural drawings and construction contracts. To afford her dream, I took on more hours at work. My 40-hour weeks became 50, then 60, then 80. I switched to a higher-paying position that I hated, but that would cover the massive mortgage. I started working weekends, holidays, taking every bit of overtime I could get. The debt piled up faster than the house did. Nearly $1 million, a number so large it doesn't even feel real anymore. It's just an abstract concept, a weight pressing down on my chest when I try to sleep at night. And even as we sank deeper into debt, my wife's spending never slowed. Premium fixtures for bathrooms I'd never have time to use. Imported tiles for a kitchen where I'd rarely eat. Landscaping for a yard I'd only see in the dim light of early morning as I left for work. Each time I tried to talk about cutting back, she'd look hurt, as though I was attacking her personally rather than trying to address our financial reality. "Don't you want us to be happy?" she'd ask, as though happiness could only be found in Italian marble and custom cabinetry. I remember the day we moved in. The house was beautiful, objectively so, all high ceilings and natural light, custom woodwork and designer finishes. My wife and her daughter ran from room to room, exclaiming over each perfect detail. I should have felt proud, accomplished. Instead, I felt a strange sense of dread, like I'd signed some Faustian bargain whose terms I was only beginning to understand. That night, I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. I lay awake in our massive new bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of the house, calculating how many hours I would need to work to pay for each square foot. I thought about my old home, already sold to help finance this monstrosity. I thought about the decades of labor stretching ahead of me. I thought about the simple joy of weekend barbecues with friends, a joy that already seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone else's past. The next morning, I left for work before dawn. As I backed out of our grand circular driveway, I looked up at the house. All its windows, dark except for the master suite where my wife still slept. It looked less like a home and more like a beautiful mausoleum where I would bury the person I used to be. It wasn't just the money. As the house consumed our finances, my wife began consuming what little time I had left. The animals came first, 2 dogs that needed walking and feeding, then 3 cats, then a fish tank that required constant maintenance. I ended up caring for all of them because she was too busy with her own projects. Then came the endless list of tasks for my rare days off. Build a garden bed, paint the guest room, install shelving in the garage, fix the leaky faucet. Tasks that could wait or that we could hire someone to do if we weren't drowning in mortgage debt. But the most frustrating drain on my time became the custody arrangement for her daughter. Twice every other week, my wife would insist I accompany her on a 6-hour round trip to drop off or pick up her daughter from her ex's place. 6 hours of sitting silently in the passenger seat while my mental to-do list grew longer and more impossible. I never complained about it at first. I told myself that this was part of being a family. That supporting my wife meant supporting her in all aspects of her life, including co-parenting. But as the demands on my time multiplied, those 6 hours of enforced idleness began to feel like torture. And it wasn't just the custody exchanges. It was the daily school drop-offs because my little girl isn't riding the bus. It was the softball games and basketball practices I was expected to attend, despite working 14-hour shifts. It was the grocery store runs on my way home when all I wanted was to collapse into bed. My life became a never-ending series of obligations, each one added to my plate without discussion or consideration for what was already there. I'd come home from a 14-hour workday only to be handed a list of things that needed to be done urgently. Urgency had lost all meaning. Everything was urgent, except my need for rest, for peace, for a moment to breathe. I remember one particular Sunday, my only day off that month. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, planning to just rest and maybe watch the game. Instead, I spent the morning fixing a broken sprinkler head, the afternoon building a bookshelf for her daughter's ever-expanding collection, and the evening deep cleaning the fish tank because one of the fish looked stressed. By the time I collapsed into bed that night, my day off had contained more labor than my work days, with none of the compensation. The next morning at work, a colleague commented on how tired I looked. When I explained my weekend, he stared at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. "Man," he said, "when do you live?" I didn't have an answer for him then. I still don't. The most insidious part was how my time was taken without acknowledgement that it was being taken at all. My wife never said, "I know you're exhausted, but I need you to do this additional thing." There was no recognition that each task, each obligation, each demand was drawing from a finite reserve. It was as though my time and energy were assumed to be infinite resources, endlessly renewable regardless of how heavily they were depleted. And perhaps worst of all, I had internalized this assumption. I had accepted that my purpose was to provide, to support, to enable, never to need, to rest, to receive. I'd become complicit in my own erasure. Somewhere along the way I became invisible in my own life. My needs, my desires, my simple human requirement for rest, all of it faded into the background noise of my wife's constant demands. I was no longer a person but a resource to be utilized, a tool to be deployed wherever and whenever she deemed necessary. I can't remember the last time anyone asked me what I wanted or needed. I can't remember the last time my schedule, my exhaustion, my breaking point was considered before another task was added to my plate. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions of existence without actually living. The irony is that I was working myself to death to provide a life I never got to experience. I was paying for a beautiful home I only saw in darkness. I was funding activities I was too exhausted to enjoy. I was building a family life in which I was merely a supporting character, never the protagonist. My wife's daughter became another obligation rather than a relationship I could nurture. How could I build a meaningful bond with her when I only saw her through the fog of exhaustion? How could I be a good father figure when I was barely holding on as a human being? Even in rare moments of downtime, I wasn't really present. My mind was always racing ahead to the next task, the next obligation, the next demand on my dwindling energy. I'd sit at family dinners hearing nothing of the conversation, seeing nothing of the faces around me, tasting nothing of the food I mechanically consumed to keep my body functioning for another day of labor. I remember one evening finding an old photo of myself, taken maybe a year before I met my wife. In it, I was grinning broadly, arms slung around a friend's shoulder, a beer in my hand and not a care in the world. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to reconnect with the person in it. He looked like a stranger to me, this relaxed, happy man with light in his eyes and energy in his stance. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be him. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, really looking at myself perhaps for the first time in years. The dark circles under my eyes had become so permanent, they seemed like a feature rather than a symptom. The lines around my mouth were etched deep from stress rather than laughter. My shoulders curled forward as if perpetually bracing for the next burden. I had aged a decade in 3 years. I placed the photo next to my reflection, and the contrast was shocking. It wasn't just physical deterioration, it was a fundamental dimming of life force. The man in the mirror was a husk, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. I wondered if my wife noticed this transformation, if she ever looked at me and thought about the vibrant person I used to be, or if she only saw what I could do for her, what I could provide, what needs I could fulfill. I wondered if she ever truly saw me at all, or if I had always been just a means to an end for her, the end being the life she had envisioned for herself, with or without my willing participation in its creation. I suspect she didn't see the change because it happened so gradually. Like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water, I had been boiled alive 1 degree at a time, too incrementally for anyone, including myself, to notice until it was too late. It happened on a Sunday. I had worked 12 days straight, including a Saturday night shift that had me coming home at 2 a.m. I had managed maybe 4 hours of broken sleep before my wife shook me awake, already dressed and expectant. "We need to leave in 20 minutes to pick up my daughter," she said, as though this was a perfectly reasonable request to make of someone who had barely slept. I felt something crack inside me then. Not dramatically, not with any noise or fanfare. Just a quiet, irreparable fracture in whatever had been holding me together all this time. "I need you to have a little more respect for my time," I said. The words came out calmly, almost clinically, as though they were being spoken by someone else. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "What time?" she demanded. "What time am I taking from you?" And then it all came pouring out. The 6-hour round trips where I sat uselessly in the passenger seat, the school drop-offs and pickups, the sports events I attended on no sleep, the grocery store runs after 14-hour shifts. All the moments of my life that had been commandeered without my consent, without even the courtesy of acknowledging the sacrifice. Her face hardened as I spoke, her eyes narrowing into slits. When I finished, she asked in a voice cold enough to freeze blood, "Oh, so you're not going to do that anymore?" I looked at her then, really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time in years, I saw no recognition of my humanity, no acknowledgement of my breaking point. I saw only entitlement and anger that her convenient resource was suddenly malfunctioning. "Nope," I said, the word falling from my lips like a stone. "I'm not. You do it by yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything unsaid between us, everything I'd swallowed down for years, finally rising to the surface. She left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the expensive custom windows I'd paid for with pieces of my life. In the stillness after her departure, I sat on the edge of our bed, trembling slightly. I felt simultaneously hollowed out and overfull, empty of the energy required to maintain my charade of contentment, yet bursting with years of suppressed resentment, grief, and rage. I wandered through our immaculate house like a ghost, touching surfaces that cost more than my first car, looking at art I had no hand in selecting. Nothing in this space reflected me. It was a stage set for someone else's life, one I was financing but not living. I found myself in the garage, the only space that held any trace of my former self. My tools hung in neat rows, my project car covered under a tarp, untouched for months. I pulled back the cover and ran my hand along the fender. The last time I'd worked on it was before we moved in, before the crushing weight of debt and obligation had squeezed every drop of joy from my existence. I sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, going nowhere. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I had handed over the keys to my life, becoming a passenger in my own journey, silent and acquiescent as others determined its course. In that moment, sitting in my dusty, unfinished project car, I felt more at home than I had in years. It represented everything I had sacrificed: leisure, passion, autonomy, identity. It was a relic of a time when I had been a person, not just a provider. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally emerged from the garage, the sun was setting. The house was still empty. No text, no call. Just silence and the growing awareness that I had disrupted something fundamental in our dynamic. I had said no. I had reclaimed a small piece of my time, my autonomy. And the world hadn't ended, not yet anyway. That was yesterday. She came back with her daughter late last night, and we've barely spoken since. The tension in the house is thick enough to cut with a knife. She moves around me like I'm a piece of furniture that's been inexplicably placed in her path. Her daughter senses the tension and stays quiet, shooting me confused, worried glances when she thinks I'm not looking. I should feel guilty. I should be apologizing, backtracking, returning to my role as the silent provider, the invisible support system that keeps their lives running smoothly. That's what I've always done before: swallowed my needs, buried my resentment, pushed down my exhaustion until it became a permanent part of my being. But I don't feel guilty. I feel awake, as though I've been sleepwalking through my life, and have suddenly opened my eyes to find myself standing at the edge of a cliff. The house I never wanted. The debt I can't escape. The 80-hour work weeks that are slowly killing me. The marriage that seems to exist only to facilitate my wife's desires and needs, while mine go unacknowledged. All of it stretches before me like a prison sentence I voluntarily accepted. I keep thinking about my old house. About lazy Sundays spent tinkering with projects I actually enjoy. About having friends over without worrying about maintaining the perfect show home. About a life that was mine, not a performance put on for others. I don't know what happens next. My wife hasn't asked me to accompany her on the next custody exchange, which is coming up in a few days. I don't know if she's giving me space, or if she's already planning her exit strategy. I don't know if saying no to this one thing has triggered the beginning of the end, or if it's the first step toward establishing a healthier dynamic. What I do know is that I can't go back to being invisible. I can't return to being a resource rather than a person. Whatever comes next, whether it's finding a way to rebuild our marriage on more equal footing, or accepting that it was built on a foundation too flawed to sustain, I need to remain present in my own life. This morning I found myself staring into my coffee cup, watching the light play on its surface. For the first time in years, I felt like I was actually inhabiting my body, rather than floating somewhere above it, observing my life from a distance. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. My wife entered the kitchen, her movements stiff and deliberate. She poured herself coffee without looking at me, maintaining the careful choreography of avoidance we'd established since her return. Her daughter followed shortly after, her eyes darting between us, sensing the fault lines running beneath the surface of our carefully constructed normalcy. I wanted to say something, to break the oppressive silence, but what was there to say? I had spoken my truth yesterday, and it hung in the air between us, undeniable and irreversible. Some words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. They change the landscape of a relationship permanently, creating new territories that must be navigated with caution. As they prepared to leave for school, my wife driving, of course, because my little girl isn't riding the bus, I noticed her daughter hesitate at the door. She turned back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it concern? Confusion? A silent plea to return to the comfortable fiction we'd all been living in? I managed a small smile, hoping to reassure her that while things were changing, she wasn't to blame. She didn't smile back, just slipped out the door behind her mother. The house fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the absence of sound while I was alone, catching precious moments of rest between obligations. This was a pregnant silence, full of possibility and peril in equal measure. The silence of a life in transition. I called in sick to work for the first time in years. I couldn't face the thought of pouring more of my diminishing life force into a job I hated, taken to support a lifestyle I never wanted. Just for today, I needed to remember what it felt like to have time that belonged to me. I spent the morning in the garage, tinkering with my project car. My hands remembered what to do even if my mind was elsewhere, working through the implications of my small rebellion. By midday, I had made more progress on the car than in the previous 6 months combined. The simple joy of working on something I actually cared about, without a deadline or external pressure, felt like rediscovering a part of myself I thought was lost forever. I've been asking myself how I got here. How did I go from a content, financially stable person with time for the things I enjoyed to a perpetually exhausted workhorse drowning in debt? How did I allow myself to become so diminished, so erased within my own life? The answer is both simple and complex. It happened one small concession at a time. Each individual sacrifice seemed reasonable in isolation. Each boundary I allowed to be crossed seemed like a minor inconvenience at the time. It was only in aggregate, only when I stepped back and looked at the full picture, that I could see how completely I had surrendered my autonomy. I wonder now if my wife ever really saw me at all. Did she fall in love with me, or with the life she thought I could provide? Does she understand that I'm breaking under the weight of her expectations, or does she simply see a tool that's malfunctioned? I honestly don't know anymore. What I do know is that I can't sustain this pace. The human body isn't designed to work 80 hours a week indefinitely. The human spirit isn't meant to exist solely in service to others' desires. Something has to change, and maybe that something is me. I'm terrified of what comes next. If I continue to assert my needs, will my marriage collapse? If I step back from the punishing work schedule, will we lose the house? If I reclaim pieces of my time, will I damage my relationship with my stepdaughter? These are real dangers, real potential consequences. But the alternative, continuing on this path until I break completely, is no longer an option. I've reached the limit of what I can give, and for the first time in years, I'm acknowledging that this limit matters. I spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhood, something I haven't done since we moved in. The houses here are all like ours, grand, immaculate, imposing. I wondered about the people inside them. Were they happy? Were they drowning in debt like me? Were they working themselves to death to maintain a facade of success? Or had they found some balance I couldn't seem to achieve? I passed a man about my age washing his car in his driveway. He waved, and I waved back, surprised by the simple human connection. We chatted briefly, about nothing, about everything. The weather, the neighborhood, his vintage Mustang. He invited me to a block party happening next weekend. I told him I'd try to make it, knowing full well I'd probably be working or handling some crisis at home. Still, the invitation warmed something in me that had been cold for too long. As I continued my walk, I thought about community, about friendship, about all the connections I'd let wither as my marriage consumed every aspect of my existence. I thought about the person I used to be, someone who had time for casual conversations, for block parties, for washing his car on a weekday afternoon. I thought about my parents' marriage, how they had built a life together that enhanced rather than diminished them both, how they had supported each other's dreams without sacrificing their individual identities, how they had grown together rather than one growing at the other's expense. I thought about what I would tell a friend if they came to me describing my situation. Would I tell them to keep pushing through, to continue sacrificing their health, their happiness, their very self, on the altar of someone else's desires? Or would I tell them to save themselves while they still could? The answer came with startling clarity. I would tell them to run, to escape before there was nothing left of them to save, to recognize that love shouldn't feel like slow suffocation. So why was I holding myself to a different standard? Why was I willing to accept for myself what I would never advise for someone I cared about? As I returned home, the shadows lengthening across our perfectly manicured lawn, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Not the peace of resolution. There were still too many unanswered questions for that. But the peace of clarity. Of finally seeing my situation for what it was, without the filters of obligation and misplaced loyalty that had clouded my vision for so long. My wife's car was in the driveway. She and her daughter were home. I took a deep breath before entering, bracing myself for the tension, the silent accusation, the cold shoulder. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking into the house as myself, not as the hollow automaton I had become. Whatever happened next, I would face it as a whole person, not a fragmented shadow. I've decided to write all of this down before I have the conversation that might end my marriage. I need to organize my thoughts, to remind myself that I'm not being unreasonable, that my needs matter too. Tonight, when my wife and her daughter are asleep, I'm going to sit at our expensive kitchen island and make a list of non-negotiables, the boundaries I need to establish to remain functional, to remain me. I'm going to decide what I can compromise on and what I cannot. Then tomorrow, I'm going to ask my wife for an hour of her time. Just an hour, which suddenly seems like an extravagant request. I'm going to lay it all out. The unsustainable workload, the financial strain, the complete absence of personal time, the feeling of being used rather than loved. I'm going to tell her that I can't continue being the invisible support system for a life I never wanted. That we need to find a middle ground that acknowledges my humanity as well as her desires. That love shouldn't feel like a slow death. I don't know if our marriage can survive this conversation. I don't know if she's capable of seeing me as anything other than a provider, a chauffeur, a handyman, a walking wallet. I don't know if what we have is worth salvaging, or if it was built on foundations too unequal to ever be truly sound. What I do know is that I deserve more than this half-life I've been living. I deserve to exist as more than a function, more than a means to others' ends. I deserve to be seen, to be considered, to be treated as though my time and energy are finite, precious resources, rather than unlimited commodities to be consumed without thought. So no, I won't be sitting silently in the passenger seat for those 6-hour round trips anymore. And that's just the beginning of what I won't be doing. It's a small stand in the grand scheme of things, tiny really, but feels like the first step toward reclaiming my life. Whether I take that journey alone or with my wife beside me remains to be seen. But, for the first time in years, I'm acknowledging that either way, it's my journey, my life, my time, and that matters. I'm prepared for her anger, her incomprehension, her feeling of betrayal. I'm prepared for her to frame my need for boundaries as selfishness, as abandonment, as a failure to love her and her daughter properly. I'm prepared for the manipulation that has characterized so much of our relationship, the subtle ways she's learned to make me question my own needs and perceptions. What I'm not prepared for, what I can't allow myself to be prepared for, is backing down. I've spent too many years shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space she's allocated for me in her vision of our life. I've contorted myself into so many unnatural shapes trying to be what she needed that I've nearly forgotten my original form. If our marriage ends over this, it will be painful. Devastating even. The financial implications alone are terrifying. The debt we've accumulated, the house we can't afford on a single income, the lifestyle she's grown accustomed to that, requires my constant labor to maintain. The thought of hurting her daughter, who is innocent in all of this, tears at my heart. But the alternative, continuing on this path of self-erasure until there's nothing left of me but function, is no longer an option. I would rather face the pain of ending than the slow agony of disappearing by degrees. As I write these words, I feel a curious mixture of dread and hope. Dread for the difficult conversations ahead, for the upheaval that may come, for the possibility of loss and change. But hope too, hope that there might be a way forward that doesn't require my complete self-abnegation. Hope that my wife might be capable of seeing me, truly seeing me, and adjusting her expectations accordingly. Hope that we might build something new together, something sustainable and mutual, rather than extractive and one-sided. And if that hope proves unfounded, if she cannot or will not meet me in this new territory of mutual respect and consideration, then I hope for the courage to walk away, to reclaim my life, my time, my selfhood, even at great cost, to remember that I am a person, not just a provider, to believe that I deserve more than exhaustion, depletion, and invisibility. Whatever happens next, I know one thing with absolute certainty. I cannot go back to who I was yesterday. The person who said yes to everything, who accepted each new demand without question, who allowed himself to be consumed without protest, that person is gone. In his place stands someone new, or perhaps someone very old, someone who remembers what it feels like to matter, someone who is ready to fight for his right to exist as more than a function. I don't know if my marriage will survive this transformation. I don't know if my finances will recover from the choices I've made. I don't know what relationship I'll have with my stepdaughter going forward. There are so many uncertainties stretching before me, so many potential losses to grieve. But for now, in this moment of clarity, I know that I've already gained something precious, myself. The self I almost lost completely in the endless cycle of providing, supporting, enabling. The self that deserves consideration, rest, joy. The self that has been silently drowning while everyone watched. So no, I won't be sitting silently in the passenger seat for those 6-hour round trips anymore. That small no was just the beginning. The first breath of a person who had forgotten he was allowed to breathe. There will be more boundaries, more reclamations, more instances of choosing myself when self-sacrifice has become self-destruction. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving towards something rather than just running in place on a treadmill that's slowly killing me. And that feeling, that sense of agency, of possibility, of choice, is worth fighting for, even if you have to fight alone.